Picture this, a quiet Tuesday morning in small-town America. Traffic flows steadily through the main intersection as people head to work, kids walk to school, and life moves at its familiar pace. Then suddenly, the sharp blast of a police siren cuts through the morning calm. A mobility scooter sits motionless in the crosswalk, its elderly operator facing down a young police officer, whose voice carries across the street with unmistakable authority and growing frustration. What happens next will shake this community to its core and remind us all of a truth we too often forget: that respect isn't earned by the clothes we wear or the vehicles we drive, but by the character we've built and the service we've given. This is the story of Harold Martinez, a man whose weathered hands have held more than just the handles of a mobility scooter, and Officer Jake Thompson, who was about to learn the most important lesson of his career. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main intersection as rush hour began its predictable dance. But on this particular Tuesday, something was different. Something that would transform how an entire community understood the meaning of honor, sacrifice, and the price of making assumptions about people we don't really know. Harold Martinez had been making the same journey every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. At 78 years old, his mobility scooter had become his lifeline to independence, a red, reliable companion that carried him from his small apartment on Elm Street to the Veterans Affairs office downtown. The route never varied: straight down Main Street, left at the courthouse, right at the Memorial Park, then straight to the VA building where he volunteered twice a week. Harold's scooter wasn't fast. Its maximum speed barely reached 8 miles per hour, but it was steady, just like the man who operated it. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and adorned with a simple gold wedding band worn thin by time, gripped the handles with the same careful attention he'd once given to much more complex machinery in places most people couldn't imagine. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Population 12,000, nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania, it was a place where high school football games drew bigger crowds than the movie theater, where the annual 4th of July parade was planned 6 months in advance, and where the biggest controversy usually involved the town council's decisions about snow removal budgets. The residents took pride in their quiet streets, their low crime rate, and their sense of community. Veterans were respected here. The Memorial Park displayed names from every conflict since World War I, and the annual Memorial Day ceremony drew hundreds. But respect, Harold had learned, sometimes came with conditions that weren't immediately visible. Officer Jake Thompson was relatively new to the Millbrook Police Department, having joined just 18 months earlier after completing his training at the State Academy. At 26, he was eager to prove himself, perhaps too eager. He'd grown up in a larger city where police work meant constant vigilance, quick decisions, and asserting authority before situations spiraled out of control. Thompson took his job seriously, maybe too seriously for a town like Millbrook. He wrote tickets for minor infractions that his colleagues often overlooked, enforced regulations that hadn't been strictly applied in years, and approached each call with the intensity of someone expecting trouble around every corner. On this particular morning, Thompson was already running behind schedule due to a minor fender bender on the outskirts of town. His shift supervisor had reminded the entire department just last week about the importance of traffic enforcement in the school zones and main intersections, emphasizing that even minor violations needed to be addressed consistently. The intersection of Main and Courthouse Streets was Millbrook's busiest, a four-way stop that handled most of the town's through traffic. During peak hours, it could back up for several blocks, testing the patience of commuters heading to the larger city 20 miles away. The crosswalk signals were timed precisely, and the unwritten rule was that pedestrians, and by extension those on mobility devices, needed to move efficiently to keep traffic flowing. Harold had been halfway across the intersection when the light began its transition from white to orange. His scooter, moving at its steady 8-mile-per-hour pace, wasn't quite fast enough to clear the crosswalk before the signal changed. It was a situation that happened occasionally, one that most drivers understood and accommodated with patience. But Officer Thompson, already stressed from his morning delays and hyper-aware of his supervisor's recent emphasis on traffic enforcement, saw something different. He saw a violation of municipal code, a disruption of traffic flow, and an opportunity to assert the authority he felt was necessary to maintain order. The police cruiser's siren chirped twice, sharp and commanding, as Thompson pulled alongside the crosswalk. Harold, startled by the sudden noise, brought his scooter to a complete stop right in the middle of the intersection. Cars began to back up in all four directions as the elderly man sat motionless, his hands still gripping the scooter's handles, his weathered face turning toward the officer with a mixture of confusion and concern. Sir, you need to move that vehicle immediately." Thompson's voice carried the authority of his training, but it also carried something else, an edge of impatience that seemed disproportionate to the situation at hand. Harold slowly maneuvered his scooter to the sidewalk, the electric motor humming quietly as he navigated around the police cruiser. His movements were deliberate and careful, the movements of a man who understood that sudden gestures could be misinterpreted, that cooperation was always the wisest course of action. "Do you understand that you just violated Municipal Traffic Code 15.2? Thompson approached the scooter with his citation book already in hand, his posture rigid with official authority. "Failure to clear an intersection during a signal change. That's a $50 fine." Harold looked up at the young officer, his brown eyes steady and calm despite the situation. "Officer, I was moving as fast as this scooter allows. I didn't intentionally block traffic." "Intent isn't relevant to the violation, sir. The code is clear about pedestrians and mobility devices maintaining appropriate pace through intersections." Thompson's pen was poised over his citation book, ready to translate this encounter into official documentation. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Morning commuters, delayed by the traffic backup, had stepped out of their cars to see what was causing the commotion. Shop owners from the nearby storefronts had emerged to watch the unusual scene unfolding at their busiest intersection. Conditions there, nearly tension to the point of anguish, were unprecedented. Margaret Shen, who owned the flower shop on the corner, recognized Harold immediately. "Officer, that's Mr. Martinez. He makes this same trip twice a week. He volunteers at the VA office." Thompson barely glanced in her direction. "Ma'am, I need you to step back, please. This is official police business." Harold remained calm, his voice steady and respectful. "Officer Thompson?" He read the nameplate carefully. "I understand you're doing your job. If you need to write a citation, I won't argue. But I was doing my best to cross safely and efficiently." The use of his name seemed to surprise Thompson slightly, but it didn't soften his approach. "How do you know my name?" "I make it my business to know the officers who serve our community," Harold replied simply. "My late wife always said that knowing your neighbors makes for a stronger town." Thompson felt a flicker of something. Was it doubt? But pushed it aside. Rules were rules, and consistent enforcement was what separated professional policing from arbitrary favoritism. "Sir, I'm going to need to see identification and registration for this mobility device." "Registration?" Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. "Officer, this is a personal mobility scooter. I wasn't aware they required registration. Any motorized vehicle operating on public streets requires proper documentation," Thompson replied, though he was less certain about this particular regulation than he sounded. The crowd was growing larger now, and Harold could hear murmurs of conversation around him. Some voices carried support, others confusion, and a few showed clear irritation at what seemed like an excessive response to a minor traffic situation. "Officer," Harold said quietly, "I have my driver's license, though it's expired since I no longer drive a car. I have my Veterans Affairs identification card, and I have my Medicare card, which covers the medical necessity of this scooter. Will any of those help?" Thompson paused. The mention of Veterans Affairs caught his attention, but he'd been taught not to let personal circumstances influence the application of law enforcement. Sir, an expired license doesn't satisfy the requirement for current identification. Harold reached into his wallet with slow, deliberate movements, producing a VA identification card that he handed to the officer. Thompson glanced at it briefly, noting the official seal and Harold's photograph, but he was focused on completing the citation process efficiently. "Mr. Martinez, I'm issuing you a citation for failure to clear an intersection during signal change, and a warning for operating a motorized vehicle without current registration. You'll need to appear at the municipal building within 30 days to resolve this matter." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Thompson could sense their disapproval. But he'd been trained to complete his duties regardless of public opinion, to maintain authority even in the face of criticism. Harold accepted the citation with quiet dignity, folding it carefully and placing it in his wallet, alongside his identification cards. "Thank you, Officer Thompson. I'll handle this appropriately." Officer Blaze toggled the CRV mount. Lights rained upon the buildings. As Thompson turned to return to his patrol car, an elderly woman from the crowd called out, "Officer, do you know who you just cited?" Thompson stopped, his hand on the car door handle. "Ma'am, it doesn't matter who he is. The law applies to everyone equally. This man served 3 tours in Vietnam," she continued, her voice carrying across the intersection. "He earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. He lost his son in Afghanistan 10 years ago." Thompson felt something shift in his chest, but he maintained his professional composure. "I appreciate his service, but that doesn't change the traffic violation that occurred." Harold, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Patterson, thank you, but the officer is right. Everyone should follow the same rules." What the gathered crowd didn't know, what Officer Thompson couldn't have guessed, and what Harold Martinez had never shared with anyone in Millbrook, was the full story of those 3 tours in Vietnam. Between 1967 and 1970, Sergeant Harold Martinez had served with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, participating in some of the most challenging operations of the conflict. His first tour had been a baptism by fire, literally. The humid jungles of Southeast Asia, where every shadow could hide an enemy, and every step could trigger a hidden explosive, had transformed a 19-year-old kid from rural Pennsylvania into a soldier who understood the true meaning of vigilance, sacrifice, and brotherhood. During his second tour, Harold had been promoted to squad leader, responsible for 12 young men whose lives depended on his decisions. The weight of that responsibility had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with calendar years. He'd learned to make impossible choices, to live with consequences that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. It was during his third tour that Harold had earned his decorations, though he'd never spoken about the specific actions that had warranted them. The Bronze Star had come after a firefight where his quick thinking and disregard for his own safety had saved half his platoon from an ambush. The Purple Heart had been earned the same day, when shrapnel from a mortar round had left permanent scars across his left shoulder and back. But the medal that meant the most to Harold was one that had never been officially awarded, the respect of the men who'd served alongside him. They'd called him Steady Martinez, not for his ability to remain calm under fire, though that was legendary, but for his unwavering commitment to bringing every man home alive. After Vietnam, Harold had returned to a country that wasn't entirely sure how to welcome its veterans home. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Elena, had built a life working construction, and had raised a son who would follow in his father's footsteps by joining the army. David Martinez had been everything Harold had hoped for in a son: intelligent, compassionate, brave, and dedicated to serving something larger than himself. David's deployment to Afghanistan in 2013 had filled Harold with a mixture of pride and terror that only a veteran parent could understand. He'd known the dangers, understood the complexities of modern warfare, and had spent sleepless nights wondering if the lessons he'd taught his son would be enough to keep him safe. The knock on the door had come on a Tuesday morning just like this one. Two officers in dress uniforms, their faces bearing the solemn expression that Harold had learned to recognize from his own experience, delivering similar news to other families. Staff Sergeant David Martinez had been killed by an improvised explosive device while leading a convoy through a dangerous sector of Kandahar province. Elena had never recovered from the loss. The grief had consumed her slowly but surely, and she'd passed away just 2 years later, leaving Harold alone with his memories, his scooter, and his twice-weekly volunteer work at the VA office, where he helped other veterans navigate the complex world of benefits and bureaucracy. The mobility scooter hadn't been Harold's choice initially. After Elena's death, his own health had begun to decline. Arthritis in his knees, a legacy of those long patrols in Vietnamese jungles, had made walking difficult. The doctors had recommended the scooter as a way to maintain his independence, to continue the volunteer work that gave his life meaning. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Harold would make his slow journey to the VA office, where he would spend hours helping younger veterans, men and women returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, with wounds both visible and hidden. He would listen to their stories, help them navigate the paperwork, and offer the kind of understanding that could only come from someone who had walked a similar path. The work wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't well paid. It was entirely voluntary, but for Harold it was a way to honor David's memory, to ensure that the current generation of veterans received the support and respect that his own generation had sometimes been denied. Harold had never sought recognition for his service or his volunteer work. In his mind, he was simply doing what needed to be done, fulfilling obligations that extended far beyond any official duty. The idea that his daily routine would intersect with law enforcement in such a public way had never occurred to him. As Officer Thompson finished writing the citation and prepared to clear the intersection, neither he nor Harold could have predicted what was about to happen. The military convoy that appeared at the end of Main Street had not been scheduled, was not part of any planned event, and was completely coincidental to the morning's events. The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles, 2 Humvees and a command vehicle, traveling through Millbrook on their way to a training exercise at a facility 2 counties away. The unit was from the Pennsylvania National Guard, conducting a routine transport of personnel and equipment, and they had chosen the route through town simply because it was the most direct path to their destination. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, riding in the lead vehicle, had served 3 deployments herself, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. At 42, she was a career soldier who had earned her rank through competence, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to the men and women under her command. She understood the military culture of honor, respect, and mutual support that bound veterans together across generations and conflicts. As the convoy approached the main intersection, Colonel Mitchell noticed the unusual scene unfolding: a police officer standing beside an elderly man on a mobility scooter, surrounded by a crowd of onlookers. Traffic was backed up in all directions, and the situation appeared to have reached some kind of official conclusion. The colonel's attention was caught not by the drama of the scene, but by something far more significant: the bearing and posture of the elderly man on the scooter. Even from a distance, even in this apparently difficult situation, the man carried himself with a dignity and composure that she recognized immediately. "Stop the convoy," she instructed her driver. "Pull over." As the military vehicles came to a halt, Colonel Mitchell stepped out of the lead Humvee. She was in full dress uniform, as were the other soldiers in the convoy, and her appearance immediately caught the attention of everyone at the intersection. She approached the scene with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command, her eyes taking in the details of the situation. The citation in Harold's hands, the uncomfortable body language of the police officer, the mixture of curiosity and tension radiating from the gathered crowd. But it was when Harold looked up to see her approaching that everything changed. Colonel Mitchell found herself looking into the eyes of a man she recognized, not personally, but professionally. The calm acceptance of difficulty, the quiet dignity under pressure, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had served with honor and distinction. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Officer Thompson first. "I'm Colonel Mitchell, Pennsylvania National Guard. I noticed the situation here and wanted to ensure that traffic flow would be restored for our convoy." Thompson straightened immediately, recognizing the authority represented by her rank and uniform. "Yes, ma'am. We're just completing a traffic citation. The intersection will be clear momentarily." Colonel Mitchell nodded, then turned her attention to Harold. She noticed the VA identification card still visible in his wallet, the careful way he held himself despite the obvious stress of the situation, and most importantly, the small pin on his jacket collar, a pin that she recognized immediately. It was a 173rd Airborne Brigade pin, worn smooth by decades of handling, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Colonel Mitchell's grandfather had served with the 173rd in Vietnam, and she had grown up hearing stories about the unit's service, their sacrifices, and the bonds that connected them across generations. "Sir," she said, addressing Harold directly, "I noticed your 173rd pin. When did you serve?" Harold looked up at her, surprise flickering across his weathered features. 1967 to 1970, Colonel. 3 tours." The intersection had gone completely quiet. Officer Thompson, the gathered crowd, even the drivers in the backed-up cars seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though most couldn't have explained exactly what it was. Colonel Mitchell came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Sergeant Martinez, on behalf of a grateful nation and a fellow soldier, thank you for your service." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Harold, still seated on his mobility scooter, slowly raised his right hand to return the salute with a precision and dignity that made it clear this was not a gesture he had forgotten how to perform. Officer Thompson watched this exchange with growing realization and dawning horror. The elderly man he had just cited, the person he had treated as a routine traffic violator, was being honored by a full colonel in the United States military. But Colonel Mitchell wasn't finished. She had noticed something else. The small gold star pin on Harold's jacket, positioned just below the 173rd pin. It was a pin that represented the ultimate sacrifice, one that identified Harold as a Gold Star father, a parent who had lost a child in military service. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I see you're also a Gold Star father. I'm sorry for your loss." Harold's composure, which had remained steady throughout the entire morning's ordeal, finally began to crack. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of years of carefully controlled grief. "Thank you, Colonel. Staff Sergeant David Martinez, killed in action in Afghanistan, 2013. The crowd, many of whom had known Harold for years without knowing the full story of his service and sacrifice, began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just about a traffic citation anymore. This was about recognition, respect, and the complex ways that service and sacrifice intersect with daily life in small-town America. Colonel Mitchell turned to address Officer Thompson, her voice carrying the authority of her rank, but also the measured tone of someone who understood that this was a teaching moment rather than a confrontation. "Officer Thompson, I don't know the details of what happened here this morning, but I want you to understand something about the man you're dealing with. Sergeant Martinez served his country with distinction during one of our most challenging conflicts. He earned decorations for valor, and he lost a son in service to our nation. Men like him are the reason you and I have the freedom to serve and protect our communities." Thompson felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. Everything about the morning's encounter suddenly looked different through this new lens of understanding. The quiet dignity he had interpreted as potential defiance, the careful movements he had seen as possible resistance, the respectful responses he had dismissed as routine compliance, all of it took on new meaning. The emotional weight of the moment seemed to settle over the intersection like a blanket. Harold, overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition and the painful memories it had stirred, struggled to maintain his composure. The citation, which had seemed like such an important matter just minutes before, now felt trivial in comparison to the deeper questions being raised about respect, service, and the assumptions we make about the people around us. Officer Thompson approached Harold's scooter, his entire demeanor transformed from authoritative enforcement to humble recognition. "Mr. Martinez, Sergeant Martinez, I owe you an apology. I had no idea about your service, your sacrifice, your loss. I should have handled this situation differently." Harold looked up at the young officer, seeing not the aggressive authority figure from earlier, but a young man struggling with the realization that he had made a significant mistake. "Officer Thompson, you were doing your job. You couldn't have known my background." "But that's exactly the point," Thompson replied, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "I should have approached this situation with more respect, more understanding, more patience. I let procedure override basic human decency." Colonel Mitchell, recognizing the educational value of this moment, addressed not just Thompson but the entire gathered crowd. "This is why we honor our veterans, why we remember their service, why we approach each other with respect and dignity. You never know who has carried the burden of defending our freedoms, who has sacrificed for our security, who has paid prices we can't imagine." Margaret Chen, the flower shop owner who had tried to speak up earlier, stepped forward. "Sergeant Martinez, I've seen you make this trip twice a week for 3 years. I never knew about your son, about your service. I should have done more to support you." Harold's response was immediate and characteristic of the man he had always been. "Mrs. Chen, you've always been kind to me. You wave when I pass your shop. You've helped me with my scooter when it's rained. That's support enough." But the crowd wasn't satisfied with that answer. One by one, other residents began to speak up, sharing their own small interactions with Harold, their own regrets about not knowing his story, their own desires to do better in the future. Tom Rodriguez, who owned the hardware store, stepped forward. "Sergeant, I want to make sure your scooter is always in perfect working order. No charge, ever." Sarah Williams, a teacher at the local elementary school, added, "My students should know about heroes like you and your son. Would you consider speaking to our classes about service and sacrifice?" Harold found himself overwhelmed not by the recognition but by the genuine warmth and respect being offered by his neighbors. These were people he had seen regularly for years, people who had always been polite and friendly, but who were now offering something deeper. Understanding, support, and genuine community. Officer Thompson, meanwhile, was grappling with his own transformation. "Sergeant Martinez, I want to tear up this citation. But more than that, I want to learn from this experience. Would you be willing to help me understand how to better serve veterans in our community?" Harold studied the young officer for a long moment, seeing past the uniform to the person beneath, someone who was genuinely remorseful, genuinely eager to grow, genuinely committed to becoming better at his job and his service to the community. "Officer Thompson," Harold said finally, "I'd be honored to help, but I want you to keep the citation." The crowd stirred with surprise, and Thompson looked confused. "Sir?" Harold's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of his years and experience. "Keep it as a reminder, not of a mistake, but of a learning opportunity. Today changed both of us, and it changed this community. That citation represents the moment when we all chose to do better, to understand more, to respect each other more deeply." Colonel Mitchell, who had been quietly observing this exchange, stepped forward once more. "Sergeant Martinez, our convoy is heading to a training facility about 50 miles from here. We're conducting leadership exercises with young soldiers, teaching them about honor, respect, and service. Would you consider joining us as a guest speaker? Your story, your example could make a real difference in their understanding of what military service means." Harold looked around at the faces surrounding him, the police officer who had learned a valuable lesson, the neighbors who had gained new understanding, the military personnel who recognized his service, and the broader community that had been transformed by a simple traffic stop that had become something much more significant. "Colonel," he said, "I'd be honored. But first, I need to get to the VA office. There are other veterans waiting for help with their paperwork, and they're counting on me to be there." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, and Harold found himself embarrassed by the attention. This had never been about recognition for him. It had always been about service, about doing what needed to be done, about honoring the memory of his son and the legacy of his own military experience. The resolution of the morning's events created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Officer Thompson, profoundly affected by his encounter with Harold, requested additional training in veteran affairs and community relations. He began visiting the VA office regularly, not in an official capacity but as a volunteer, learning about the challenges faced by veterans and developing relationships that would make him a more effective and compassionate police officer. The citation was never processed. Instead, Thompson had it framed and placed on his desk as a daily reminder of the importance of approaching every interaction with respect, patience, and understanding. His colleagues noticed the change in his demeanor, his increased sensitivity to community needs, and his enhanced ability to de-escalate tense situations. Colonel Mitchell followed through on her invitation, and Harold became a regular guest speaker at military training facilities throughout the region. His quiet, dignified presence and his stories of service, sacrifice, and resilience had a profound impact on young soldiers preparing for their own deployments. He never spoke about his decorations or his heroic actions, but instead focused on the bonds between soldiers, the importance of looking out for each other, and the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform. The community of Millbrook was transformed as well. The Memorial Park, which had always been a place of quiet respect, became a more active center of veteran support. Local businesses began offering services and discounts to veterans, not as publicity stunts but as genuine expressions of gratitude and recognition. Margaret Chen started an informal network of support for veterans in the community, coordinating everything from transportation assistance to social gatherings. Tom Rodriguez not only maintained Harold's scooter free of charge, but also began offering similar services to other veterans with mobility challenges. The elementary school where Sarah Williams taught developed a comprehensive curriculum about military service, sacrifice, and the importance of community support for veterans. Harold became a regular visitor, sharing age-appropriate stories about service and helping students understand the connection between individual sacrifice and collective freedom. But perhaps the most significant change was in the daily interactions between Harold and his neighbors. The polite nods and casual greetings were replaced by genuine conversations, offers of assistance, and a level of community integration that Harold hadn't experienced since Elena's death. His twice-weekly trips to the VA office became community events in their own way. Shopkeepers would come out to wave, children would stop to say hello, and other veterans began timing their own errands to coincide with Harold's schedule, creating informal parades of mutual support and recognition. Harold himself was initially uncomfortable with the increased attention, but he gradually came to understand that accepting the community's support was itself a form of service. By allowing his neighbors to express their gratitude and respect, he was helping them become better versions of themselves, more connected to their community, and more aware of the sacrifices that protect their way of life. The intersection where the morning's events had unfolded was eventually renamed Veterans Corner, with a small plaque explaining the significance of the location and honoring all who had served. It became a gathering place for Memorial Day and Veterans Day observances, but more importantly, it served as a daily reminder to everyone who passed through it about the importance of treating each other with dignity and respect. 6 months later, Harold continued his routine trips to the VA office, now including weekly visits to the police station and monthly school presentations. His mobility scooter had become a symbol of resilience and ongoing service. Officer Thompson grew into the department's most effective community liaison, specializing in veteran affairs. He never forgot the lesson learned at that intersection, sharing it with every new officer. Colonel Mitchell maintained her connection with Harold, regularly inviting him to speak at military events. She often said Harold's example taught her more about leadership than any formal training. but the lasting impact was on Millbrook itself. The community learned that respect means recognizing everyone's humanity and worth, understanding that everyone has a story, and that freedom comes at prices we rarely consider. Harold never sought to be a symbol. He simply continued living with quiet dignity and selfless service. But his example reminded everyone that heroism isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's maintaining composure under pressure, and continuing to serve when service goes unrecognized. The mobility scooter still moves at 8 miles per hour down Main Street twice a week, now carrying the hopes and gratitude of an entire community that learned to see beyond appearances. This story reminds us that every person deserves respect, regardless of circumstances. Harold represents thousands of veterans who continue serving their communities with dignity, asking for nothing more than basic human respect. Officer Thompson's transformation shows that mistakes become learning opportunities through humility and genuine growth. His willingness to change demonstrates that deeper community connections enhance law enforcement effectiveness. Millbrook discovered that supporting veterans means daily recognition and meaningful action, not just ceremonies. If this story moved you, if it reminded you to treat others with greater respect and understanding, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more stories celebrating human dignity. In a world emphasizing differences, we need reminders of what connects us and what happens when we choose respect over assumption, understanding over judgment, and community over division.